Now, archaeologists have a fresh new take on the one clue we know for sure they left behind. A single word carved onto a gatepost. Croatoan.
An incredibly important Native American site, and the suggestion is that this is the place where the lost colonists came to.
There's a small piece of paper on a map, roughly the size of a postage stamp, glued down flat, no crease, no tear beneath it, just a patch, the kind a careful artist makes when they want to correct a mistake and start over. Nobody questioned it for 425 years. The map is a masterpiece. It was painted in the 1580s by a man who was actually there, a governor, an artist, one of the first Englishmen to document the New World with his own eyes. Scholars had studied every inch of it. Historians had written entire books using it as a primary source. It hung in the British Museum, catalogued and preserved, and examined by experts across 4 centuries. And for 4 centuries, everyone assumed the patch was just a correction, a mistake covered over, nothing underneath. In 2012, a researcher asked the British Museum to put the map on a light table.
They may now know what happened.
Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing. Now, there are a lot of competing theories about what exactly happened, and the team working on Hatteras Island believes there's enough proof to show that's where at least some of the colonists likely went.
What they found underneath that unremarkable scrap of paper was a symbol, a fort, hidden in bright red and blue ink, drawn in a deliberate location, exactly 50 miles from where 117 English men, women, and children had vanished without a trace. Someone had concealed it, and once you understand what was hidden, and why, and what archaeologists have spent the last decade digging up to confirm it, the story of America's most baffling mystery doesn't end with a disappearance at all. It ends with a choice. The year is 1587. England is trying to plant its flag in the New World before Spain devours the entire continent. A group of 117 colonists, men, women, a handful of children, set sail from Plymouth under the leadership of a painter-turned-governor named John White. They're not soldiers, they're families. Ordinary people who signed up for something extraordinary, the first permanent English settlement in America, on a sliver of island called Roanoke, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The island is low and flat, ringed with salt marsh grass that bends in the wind off Pamlico Sound. The air is thick with humidity, warm even in early summer, carrying the mineral smell of the sea and the rich rot of estuary mud. To the west, across the Sound, the dark line of the mainland. To the east, the Outer Banks, a thin ribbon of sand separating the colony from the open Atlantic. Roanoke sits between 2 worlds, neither fully sheltered nor fully exposed. The settlers who first set foot on it understood immediately that it was not a permanent home. It was a staging post, but a staging post for what exactly was already in dispute. The colony had barely unpacked before trouble began. Their relationship with the nearest indigenous people, the Secaucus, had been damaged by an earlier English expedition that destroyed a village and killed a chief over a stolen silver cup. White did his best to rebuild trust, but the damage ran deep. One of the colonists, a Croatoan man named Manteo, served as diplomat and guide, and it was through Manteo that the settlers developed ties to the Croatoan people on a neighboring island to the south. By late summer 1587, the colony was struggling. Supplies were running thin. The resupply ship they'd been promised had not arrived. The settlers were growing desperate, and they had already begun to discuss what they'd do if England didn't come. The answer, according to White's own journals, was clear. They would move 50 miles into the mainland, away from the exposed coast, deeper into territory where they had indigenous allies and access to fresh water. White sailed back to England for supplies in August 1587. He left behind his daughter, Eleanor, and Eleanor's daughter, a baby girl born just 9 days before his departure, the first English child born on American soil. They named her Virginia Dare. White fully intended to return within months. He kissed his daughter. He held his granddaughter. Then he climbed aboard a ship and watched the island shrink to a dark line on the horizon and then disappear. He had no way of knowing it was the last time he would ever see either of them. The Anglo-Spanish War, the Spanish Armada, every English ship pressed into naval service. White spent 3 agonizing years trying to get back, watching his petitions denied, watching ships turn away, before he finally made landfall on Roanoke Island on August 18th, 1590. His granddaughter was 3 years old. He hadn't seen her since she was 9 days old. The settlement was gone. Not burned, not destroyed in battle, gone. The buildings had been dismantled, carefully, deliberately, as if the colonists had packed their things and left. The palisade wall still stood. No bodies, no graves, no signs of violence, only 2 carved messages. Into a tree, the letters CRO. Into the post of the palisade, Croatoan. White knew what Croatoan was. It was the island to the south, the island where Manteo was born, the island of their friends. He had agreed with the colonists before leaving that if they moved, they would carve their destination into a post. If they were in danger, they'd add a cross. There was no cross. White wrote in his journal that he was greatly joyed at finding the word. He believed in that moment that his people were safe. He never found them. A storm drove his ship away before he could reach Croatoan. Rough seas. A lost anchor. The captain refused to risk his vessel. White sailed back to England, and the colony passed into legend. For 400 years, historians argued about what happened next. One word carved in wood and nothing else. Until a researcher had a thought so simple it sounds obvious in retrospect. What if we look underneath that patch? The map is called La Virginea Pars. It was painted by White during the exploratory voyages of 1585 and 1586, before he became governor. It's a remarkably accurate rendering of the North Carolina coastline, the bays, the rivers, the locations of dozens of indigenous villages plotted with precision. Scholars had relied on it for centuries. Nobody had questioned 2 small patches of paper glued to its surface. Patches were routine. Artists made mistakes. You cover, you redraw. Perfectly normal. In early 2012, a researcher examining White's drawings noticed something odd about one of the patches. It wasn't covering a tear. There was no error visible at its edges. It was just placed, covering something. He contacted the British Museum in February. By the following morning, he had his answer. When the curators placed the map on a light table, the image beneath the patch became visible, and what they saw stopped them. A fort symbol, rendered in bright red and vivid blue ink, the colors of something planned and deliberate, not an accidental sketch. Located at the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina, 100 miles from the coast, deep inland. A British museum curator was the one holding the light table when the symbol appeared. Her words, documented in the museum's published account. I think we just discovered the intended site for the city of Raleigh, the colony that John White was sent to Virginia to found, 50 miles from Roanoke Island, the exact distance the colonists had told White they planned to move. The fort had been deliberately concealed. The leading theory, Sir Walter Raleigh's team covered it to keep the location hidden from Spanish spies. England and Spain were at war. If Spain knew where the colonists had retreated, they could send ships to destroy the settlement. The patch wasn't a correction. It was classified information. For 425 years, it worked. The implications were immediate. If the fort existed, the colonists hadn't vanished. They had walked away, deliberately, toward a pre-planned location, and someone with access to the map had known it all along. Archaeologists named the inland location Site X, as in X marks the spot. They began to dig in 2015. What they found wasn't a city, but it was something. The excavation site sits in quiet farmland in Bertie County, just across Albemarle Sound from the town of Edenton. There's no dramatic landscape here. No ruins jutting from the earth, just flat Carolina soil. Heat in the summer, the distant sound of the Roanoke River. Archaeologists use satellite-based remote sensing technology before they ever turned a shovel. The scans showed no fort layout, no obvious settlement pattern. That was deflating. But when they started digging, they found something more interesting than expected. Artifacts. Not 1 or 2 stray items, dozens of pottery shards, a specific type of glazed English ceramic called border ware, a style produced only in Surrey, England, and found at the earliest settlement sites in colonial Virginia, an aglet, a small metal tip from the end of a shoelace, the kind worn by 16th century Englishmen, a tenterhook, an iron hook used to stretch cloth while it dries, items of everyday colonial life. Items that had no business being in the middle of rural North Carolina in the 16th century unless someone carried them there. The team from the First Colony Foundation concluded those artifacts could have come from only one group. No Spanish expedition reached this far inland. No French traders operated in this region. The ceramics were British, The style was right, the date range matched, the data was clear, the implications were anything but. There was no fort, no mass settlement, no sign of the entire colony living here. What the artifacts suggested was something more nuanced, and in some ways more haunting, a smaller group, a fragment. Survivors who had made it inland and integrated into the indigenous community already living nearby, an Algonquian village called Metaquem, just beyond the dig's outer boundary. 2 miles from Site X, ground-penetrating radar revealed another subsurface anomaly. In 2019, archaeologists dug what they called Site Y. More ceramics came up, not just British pottery this time, but fragments from different parts of Europe. Spanish olive jars, storage vessels, the kind used for long-term food storage. Long-term residence, not a temporary camp. Someone had lived here. Someone who ate from European vessels but chose not to build a European settlement. If the inland theory explains one group, what about the Croatoan carving itself? What about the people who went south to Croatoan Island, where Manteo was born, where the settlers said they had friends? Croatoan Island is now called Hatteras. It's one of the Outer Banks barrier islands, a long, narrow strip of sand and maritime forest exposed to Atlantic weather on one side and the calmer waters of Pamlico Sound on the other. Researchers had been digging there for decades, but the best evidence came from an unlikely source: a handful of iron flakes, barely larger than grains of rice. They're called hammer scale. They're what falls off hot metal when a blacksmith hammers a piece of iron on a forge. Microscopic shavings of oxidized metal, produced by the collision of hammer and anvil. You can't make them without iron forging technology. You can't make them without fire hot enough to raise metal to working temperature. And in the 16th century, on Hatteras Island, that technology did not exist among the Croatoan people. Not one indigenous community on the eastern seaboard at that time practiced iron forging. When a researcher announced the hammer scale discovery at a museum event in Plymouth, North Carolina, the room went quiet. The key significance of hammer scale, the archaeologist explained, is that it's evidence of ironworking, of forging at that moment. Hammer scale is what comes off a blacksmith's forge. This is metal that has to be raised to a relatively high temperature, which requires technology that Native Americans at this period did not have. Someone was forging iron on Hatteras Island in the 16th century, and the only people in the region with that technology were the Roanoke colonists. The hammer scale didn't stand alone. Around it, gun parts, nautical fittings, small cannonballs, a Tudor rose emblem, a distinctly English royal symbol, a European trade token, all of it excavated from Croatoan-era layers, all of it consistent with a community that was living as Croatoan in most ways but still practicing English crafts. Researchers from the Croatoan Archaeological Society, who have been working this site for years, stated their conclusion plainly: the colony was never lost. Some of the settlers came to Hatteras. They assimilated into the Croatoan community. They brought their tools and their symbols and their forge techniques, and they lived out their lives as part of a people who had chosen to welcome them. That is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. Not that the colonists died, that they survived, that they walked away from England deliberately, merged into a culture they had learned to trust, and vanished from European history, not through catastrophe, but through choice. For the better part of 4 centuries, the dominant story was darker: massacre, disease, starvation. Historians writing in the early 1600s reported that Jamestown settlers had heard from indigenous informants that the Roanoke colonists were killed, slaughtered by a chief named Powhatan. The story spread. It calcified into orthodoxy. In 2016, a popular horror anthology series brought the massacre theory to tens of millions of viewers, presenting it as historical fact. The episode racked up massive ratings. The Croatoan carving became synonymous with doom. The problem is that the archaeology simply does not support it. When White returned in 1590, there were no bodies, no blood, no burned structures. The buildings had been disassembled, planks removed, posts pulled up, with the methodical care of people preparing for a planned move. The palisade wall had been reinforced, not breached. If there had been an attack violent enough to kill 117 people, something would remain. Nothing did. What fact-checkers and historians have pointed out in the years since is that the Jamestown reports of a massacre came secondhand, from political informants decades after the fact, and that Powhatan had strong motives to tell the Jamestown settlers what they wanted to hear. The reports were never verified. No mass grave was ever found on Roanoke Island. No forensic evidence of violence has surfaced at any related dig site. The rumor spread because it fit the narrative people wanted. The wilderness swallowing the innocent, the darkness claiming those who ventured too far. What the verified evidence actually suggests is almost the opposite. The colonists were not claimed by the darkness. They walked toward the people who already knew how to live in that world. The massacre theory was a story we told ourselves. The hammer scale, the pottery shards, the hidden fort beneath a patch of paper, they tell a different one. It's worth noting that not every researcher is ready to call the case closed. Some archaeologists caution that the colony site has not been fully excavated, that there are still areas of Roanoke Island, Hatteras, and Bertie County that haven't been dug. A few dozen artifacts across multiple sites is powerful circumstantial evidence, they argue, but not a complete picture. That's a fair point. The scientific standard demands more than pointing in a direction. It demands arriving at a destination. But the direction the evidence points has not shifted in 10 years of fieldwork. It keeps pointing the same way. If you're finding this as compelling as we do, here's where the trail leads next. Before we talk about what the evidence means, consider what it took to find it. A researcher noticed an odd patch on a map and made a phone call. An archaeologist spotted a pottery shard in soil that had never been disturbed by a European trowel. A field team sifted through the dirt of a barrier island and found iron flakes so small they could have been mistaken for rust. Nobody had a revelation. Nobody uncovered a vault. The answer to one of American history's most durable mysteries came in fragments, over decades, because a small number of people kept asking the question when everyone else had moved on. The convergence of 3 lines of evidence, the hidden fort, the inland pottery, the Hatteras ironworking, has led most serious researchers to a single conclusion: the colony split. One group, probably a smaller contingent, went south to Croatoan Island as the carved message indicated. They integrated into the Croatoan community, practiced their crafts alongside their new neighbors, and within a generation or two, were indistinguishable from the people around them. Some scholars argue their descendants may still exist, that the DNA, the blood, the cultural memory of those 117 colonists flows through communities whose families have lived on the outer banks for centuries. A second group went inland toward the pre-planned location near the Chowan River. They settled near an Algonquian village, probably with the knowledge and consent of the community there. They left behind the border ware, the aglets, the fragments of a life carried 50 miles through swamp and forest. And perhaps a third group did something else entirely. That possibility remains open. Some scholars have proposed a theory that adds one more layer to the puzzle. The Lumbee people, a large indigenous nation based in Robeson County, North Carolina, have long maintained an oral tradition that includes the Roanoke colonists. Some Lumbee families carry surnames that appear in the 1587 colony roster: Dare, Harvey, Berry, Sampson. Researchers have noted these names in Lumbee genealogical records as far back as the 18th century. The Lumbee claim is controversial. Some historians treat it as coincidence, noting that English surnames spread widely in colonial America. Others point to the specific overlap with colony surnames as something that demands closer examination. No DNA study has definitively confirmed or ruled it out. The research continues. If we follow this evidence to its logical conclusion, the picture that emerges is not a tragedy. It's something rarer and more complicated. A group of English people, stranded by war and circumstance, made a decision that no English colonial government would have approved of. They abandoned the project of empire. They walked into the indigenous world and stayed. One interpretation, conventional but increasingly harder to maintain, is that assimilation was forced, that the colonists had no choice, that they were absorbed by necessity into communities that could have destroyed them. The evidence doesn't really support that reading. The carved message, the pre-planned locations, the intact palisade. These are not the signs of people fleeing in chaos. They're the signs of people executing a plan. A more uncomfortable interpretation is this: that the colonists chose to stay. That after years of hardship, after watching England fail them again and again, after learning to rely on the Croatoan and the inland Algonquian peoples for food and knowledge and survival, they decided that the European project wasn't worth returning to. They had found something better. They had found people who knew how to live. That interpretation doesn't sit easily with 400 years of colonial mythology. We've told the Roanoke story as a ghost story for so long, a vanishing, a void, an unsolved mystery, that the actual answer feels almost anticlimactic. There was no curse, no catastrophe. The colony wasn't erased from history. It merged into it. Of course, there are simpler explanations. Some researchers are careful to note that the evidence is compelling but not conclusive. A few dozen pottery shards and a handful of iron flakes don't prove that the colonists lived long, peaceful lives in indigenous communities. They prove English presence. What happened after that presence is still, for now, beyond what the dirt can tell us. But the data doesn't care about our comfort, and the data keeps pointing the same direction. There is one name that gets lost in the archaeology: Virginia Dare. She was 9 days old when her grandfather sailed for England. She was the first English child born in the Americas, a fact celebrated by the colonists, recorded by her father and governor, referenced in the official reports sent to Queen Elizabeth. Her birth on August 18, 1587, was documented with care. Her life after that date, nothing. She would have been 3 years old when the colony moved, old enough to walk, old enough to hold someone's hand through the marsh grass and across the sound toward Croatoan. She would have grown up bilingual, absorbing Algonquian words and English words in equal measure, eating food gathered by people who had lived on this coast for 10,000 years. If she survived, and we have no reason to believe she didn't, she would have come of age in a world her grandfather could never have imagined for her. Not a colonial outpost, not a church with English prayers and English law. A world of salt wind and cypress swamp and shellfish roasting over fire, and a language her grandchildren would never be taught in school. She would not have known she was a mystery. She would not have known that her absence was the seed of a 400-year obsession. She would have just been a girl, growing up somewhere, learning from the people around her how to survive. That is worth sitting with. Consider what the first 18 months of Virginia Dare's life must have looked like if she survived the move to Croatoan. The sounds she would have grown up with were not English sounds, not the creak of timber-framed buildings or the tolling of a church bell. They were the sounds of the sound: wind off the water, the rhythm of Algonquian speech, the crack of shellfish being opened on flat stones near the shore. By the time she was old enough to ask questions, she would have been asking them in 2 languages. And the answers she received about who she was would have been shaped not by the records her grandfather kept, but by the people who fed her and kept her warm through Carolina winters. The excavations in the Elizabethan gardens in Manteo, ongoing as recently as 2024, have added another thread to the story. Researchers digging at the site of the original Algonquian village of Roanoke, the indigenous community that first hosted the English settlers in 1584, found Algonquian cooking pottery dating to the 1500s alongside a small ring of copper wire, handmade by the English technique of drawing wire through a die plate. Indigenous craftspeople of the period did not manufacture drawn copper wire. The ring was almost certainly brought by the English settlers. It was found in an indigenous settlement context, a trade, a gift, an offering. The copper had spiritual significance to the Algonquian people. Historians have noted that the English settlers understood this, that they carried copper as trade goods, specifically because they knew its value. That ring, no larger than a fingernail, is a tiny physical record of a moment of exchange between 2 peoples trying to understand each other. It was buried in the earth for 400 years and turned up in a garden. The site where the 1587 colonists built their palisade is now a National Historic Site. The fort outline is preserved. Rangers give tours. School groups walk through. And beneath the trimmed paths and interpreted exhibits, archaeologists are still digging, still finding, in 2024, additional ceramics and contact-era artifacts that push the picture further and further from a simple disappearance. There is no sealed chamber to open here, no single vault of answers. The mystery didn't end with a discovery. It ended with a slow accumulation. Pottery shards and copper rings, and invisible ink on a 4-century-old map, and iron flakes barely larger than grains of rice, until the weight of the evidence finally tipped in one direction. The colony wasn't lost. It was integrated. It was absorbed. It became something the English crown would never have planned, never have approved, never have understood. It became American. There's a kind of irony in that. England's first colonial settlement, the project meant to extend British civilization into the wilderness, succeeded in precisely the opposite way. Not by building a city, not by converting the savages, but by becoming slowly and quietly one of them. The colonists of Roanoke may be the only group in colonial American history whose primary legacy is not what they built, but what they gave up building. They abandoned the fort, they set down the flag, they picked up a fishing net. And 400 years later, we're still digging to understand why. So here's the question the evidence leaves us with. John White carved no response. He left Roanoke in 1590, knowing only that the word Croatoan was cut into a post. He spent the rest of his life in Ireland, never returning to the colony, never finding out what happened to his daughter or his granddaughter or the 115 people he led across the ocean and left behind. We don't know if he thought they survived. We don't know if the silence from England, year after year, felt to him like confirmation or like dread. What we know now, 435 years later, is this. The people he left behind likely made a decision. They did not wait for England. They did not perish, waiting to be rescued. They walked toward the people who knew this land and chose to become part of them. The question that remains, the one the archaeology can't quite settle, is whether that choice was a surrender or a triumph. Were the colonists of Roanoke the first English people in America to understand that the colonial project was going to fail them and wise enough to abandon it while they could? Or were they simply desperate survivors, pulled into the only community willing to take them in, their identities slowly erased by the weight of assimilation? Share this with someone who thinks they know how the Roanoke story ends, because the ending isn't what any of us were taught. The children of those settlers grew up speaking Algonquian. They are buried in Carolina soil, and somewhere in that soil, archaeologists are still digging, still finding the pieces of a story that was never lost, just waiting to be read.